Right, hi guys, it's Dan here, and today what I thought I would do is go through some of my favourite books in basically my favourite genre, which is historical fiction. But first, give you a little bit of context, because historical fiction is a very broad category. You know, you've got the entirety of the human experience within that potentially. So my particular area of interest is ancient and medieval history, mostly Western European ancient and medieval history. But I'm willing to expand, my horizons a bit on that. But a lot of these books will fall into that sort of category. I think I don't go much more recent than the, say, 13th or 14th century in this. So, if you like stuff like, I don't know, World War One or, Napoleonic era stuff or whatever, there's not going to be any of that in there. This is, like I say, mostly ancient and medieval, or pretty much all ancient and medieval stuff. Also, this isn't in any particular order. I'm not ranking them or anything like that. I've just picked out my favourite historical fiction books. I've sorted them into sort of vague categories, similar subgenres, I would call them. But they're not in any order of how good I think they are. But there are a lot of them here, so with that said, I'd probably best start getting through them. Now, the first few don't necessarily fit into any subgenre with the rest of them. These are kind of like, I don't know, wild cards, maybe, I guess. So I thought I'd get them out of the way first. And the first one I've got it's an absolute classic. In fact, on the cover here it says The Classic Masterpiece, and that is about right. It is Ken Follett's The Pillars of the Earth. Now, this tells the story of the building of a cathedral in 13th century England, and this was a particularly turbulent time in the history of the country. There's all kinds of rebellions going on against, and a lot of that's the backdrop to it, basically. It's called the Anarchy, the period is, and that kind of tells you what it was like. But like I said, this follows the building of a cathedral, and a lot of the people who are involved in that process, everything from the stonemasons to the monks to the townspeople where it's being built to the royal family. It's got political intrigue and treachery, it's got family drama, it's got violent conflict, the whole shebang. It's an absolutely massive book, but it is definitely worth a read. So if you like the sound of that, then I would encourage you to check it out. Right, next up we're going way further back in time, and we've got the Afghan campaign by Stephen Pressfield, and this is set in the 4th century BC during Alexander the Great's campaign to conquer what will eventually become Afghanistan. And what I really liked about this one was a couple of things. First of all, I thought it was a great examination of the nature of warfare in general. And that's not just ancient wars. There's a lot of stuff in here that has implications in the present as well. And also, I really liked his portrayal of the sort of rank and file Macedonian soldiers. I thought that he really nailed that. Their dialogue is fantastic. I thought their camaraderie was fantastic. I've read a couple of books by Stephen Pressfield. This is far and away the best one. The Afghan campaign, really enjoyed that. And the next one I've got is The Road to Jerusalem by Jan Guillou. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And this is the first book in a trilogy, the Crusades trilogy, and it follows a guy from Scandinavia called Arn, who ends up going to a monastery, and he sort of has to go and then reclaim his family heritage, but it all goes wrong, and he basically gets sent to join the Knights Templar in the Holy Land and fight in the Crusades. And I thought this was, this has a lot of elements of family drama in it as well, but also tied up with that, really it's a really interesting backdrop, having it against the Crusades. You know, that's a very interesting time period. You've got the culture clash of someone coming from all the way from Scandinavia to the Near East and having to deal with that. And then, you know, eventually in this trilogy, he ends up returning to Scandinavia. So you get that sort of reverse culture clash of him coming back as well. And I thought that was one of the best aspects of this trilogy. It's been made into a film. I wouldn't recommend the films. They're pretty poor, but the books are fantastic. Right, so the next few books I've got, the next, how many? 4 books that I've got, I would class them as epic biographies. That's how I would describe them. You know, they're basically, you know, the biography of a historical figure in historical fiction. And the first one I've got is another one set in the 4th century BC, and another one with Alexander the Great involved, although not as a main character, and that is Memnon by Scott Oden. And this follows the life of the eponymous, you know, character. And Memnon is a Greek from the city-state of Rhodes, and yeah, basically he ends up becoming this statesman and mercenary captain who is part of the resistance to Alexander the Great when he invades the Near East with his Macedonian forces. And I really didn't know anything about this guy until I'd read this book, but it was really well done. It's the only book by Scott Oden that I have read, but I'm definitely on the lookout for some more, because if they are of this quality, then I will be very interested in reading them. But yeah, Memnon, very interesting guy who, I don't know if, yeah, he's not super famous, I don't think. I definitely hadn't particularly heard of him before this. But yeah, it was very intriguing to learn a bit about him, and Scott Oden's writing style I thought was very good. The next sort of epic biography that I've got is a series, actually, and that is the Boudica series by Manda Scott. This is the first book, Dreaming the Eagle. And Boudica, if you don't know, she was the leader of a British rebellion against the Romans in AD 60 something. So the Romans had, you know, they'd conquered Britain, you know, pretty much a generation before this. But Boudica was the queen of the Iceni tribe, and she leads this big rebellion against them. Now, there are 4 books in this series, and what I thought was really good about this was the character work. I mean, Boudica herself is a very interesting. Her portrayal of Boudica, Manda Scott's portrayal of Boudica, is very interesting, and also Boudica's fictional brother Ban in this, I thought was done very well. They're kind of 2 sides of the coin, and seeing their conflict and their character arcs over the course of the 4 books was very interesting. There's some vaguely sort of slightly historical fantasy elements in this, not very much, but you know, a little bit. And also there are some sort of King Arthur references woven in there, because we don't really know basically anything about Boudica's life apart from the fact that she was the queen of this tribe and led this rebellion. So there's a lot of room for the fiction side of historical fiction, and Manda Scott does a great job of making it believable, and also creating a world, a different world out of the period that she's writing about. So yeah, highly recommended. Next up, we've got another series, and this is the first book of the Conqueror series by Conn Iggulden. It's called Wolf of the Plains, and this series follows the first few books in the series follow the life and times of Genghis Khan, and then it goes on to follow some of the life of his descendant Kublai Khan. And Genghis Khan, if you are not aware, I'm sure most of you are, he was a Mongol warlord who ended up conquering all of China. He conquered all of the Middle East, most of Asia, big chunks of Eastern Europe as well. I mean, by the time he died, he had one of the biggest empires that the world has ever seen. And Conn Iggulden he's a fantastic historical fiction author. I could have put like a couple of his series in there. The other really good one is his Emperor series about Julius Caesar, but I only wanted to put one from every author into this, so I chose his Conqueror series because I think that this is his best series. And what I really like about Conn Iggulden's writing is, I've termed these few books epic biographies, but Conn Iggulden really, his writing does get across the epic scale of things, the really world-changing events that were going on. And yet you really won't find many better than Conn Iggulden for doing that, particularly, like I say, his Conqueror series and his Emperor series. And, in a similar vein, I've got William Napier's Attila series, and this is a trilogy about Attila the Hun, who is another nomadic sort of warlord who ends up conquering vast swathes of Asia and Europe. This is a lot earlier than Genghis Khan. We're talking 5th century AD here, and is it 5th century? Yeah, 5th century. I was right. 5th century AD, and his main opponents are the Romans at the time. And Attila the Hun is one of the many contributing factors to the call it the downfall of the Roman Empire in the West. And William Napier, again, his writing style really gets across the sort of grand epic scale of events, and Attila his portrayal of Attila the Hun's life in this is very interesting. I mean, obviously we don't know an awful lot about his life, so again, this is a long time ago. There's not that many sources about it, but William Napier does a great job of providing of working it all together into a narrative. Right, so the next few books that I've got are my favourite sort of subgenre of historical fiction, if you like, and that's the kind of action, adventure heavy stuff that follows a particular time period, generally through the eyes of one character. And the first one I've got, I have just recently done a review of, so you can check that out if you want. And it is the Killer of Men series by, it's the Long War series by Christian Cameron. The first book in it is Killer of Men, and this is set during the Persian Wars. So we're going back to the 5th century BC here, and it's the Persian Wars. If you don't know, it was between the ancient Greek, or the culturally Greek regions of the sort of Eastern Mediterranean and Asia Minor, fighting against the Persian Empire. And it was the Greek victory, eventual victory over the Persians, that set them up as the dominant cultural force in that region. So it's a very important period in Western history for sure. And this is seen through the eyes of a real historical figure, Arimnestos of, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but anyway, Arimnestos of Plataea. And the thing that I love the most about this series, among many, it's got loads of good points. I mean, this is one of my favourite books of all time, basically. One of my favourite series of all time. But one of the things I love the most is Christian Cameron's clear passion for his subject matter. I mean, more than any other writer that I think I've read, his passion for the time period that he's writing about really comes across. So if you want a really immersive read that will really get you into the head of someone from that time period, then this is the one to go for, in my opinion. Right, so moving really far forward in time, we come on to the Raven trilogy by Giles Kristian. And this is set, I believe, during the 9th century. It is a Viking-based trilogy. One of 2 Viking trilogies he's done. The other one is like a prequel trilogy to this. Both of them are excellent. I decided to go for this one because it was the first one I read. It was the first trilogy that was published out of the 2 of them. And it follows an English guy called Osric, who is captured by a Viking. He's captured on a Viking raid, ends up ingratiating himself with his captors, becomes part of their crew, and goes on a load of adventures with them all over Europe. Giles Kristian has a great writing style, very fast-paced, full of action, if you like that kind of thing, which I definitely do. And he writes really good character relationships as well. You know, this Viking crew, they're a real band of brothers, and that very much comes across in these novels. So if you like that kind of thing, then yeah, definitely check this out. And another one in a similar vein, another sort of Viking-based historical fiction. There's 5 books in this series. It's the Oathsworn series by Robert Lowe. This is the first one, The Whale Road. And again, this is very fast-paced, action-heavy, band of brothers style Viking historical fiction. So yeah, I really loved this book. It had another thing. One of the things that I really enjoyed about it, as well as the sort of stuff I've just mentioned, is that he sort of integrates. He integrates little stories that are similar to a lot of the Norse myths, but put into real world context, so the kind of things that mythology could grow up from. So I really enjoyed that aspect to it as well. And Robert Lowe is a fantastic writer. He did another very good trilogy about the Scottish Wars of Independence, which are done in quite a different style, but very good nonetheless. Right, and the next action heavy historical fiction that I've got is the first book in James Aitcheson's series about the Norman conquest of England. This is the first one, Sworn Sword. All of them are very good. I'm just showing you the first one because it's the first one. So this is the Norman conquest seen through the eyes of a Norman knight, Tancred. And I thought it was a really vivid portrayal of 11th century England, and also of the life of a Norman knight. I thought that he really, a really vibrant, vivid portrayal of those things. And also, when he wrote this book, I mean, I don't know, he was in his early 20s or something. For a debut novel, for someone in his early 20s, I mean, this is absolutely fantastic work. So I would definitely encourage you to check out any of James Aitcheson's books. In fact, they're all very good, but particularly his series about the Norman Conquest. Right, and next up, we've got a couple of series about my all-time favourite period of history, which is the Anglo-Saxon period. This is set during the early Anglo-Saxon period. I've done reviews of the first 3 books in this series. It is the Bernicia Chronicles by Matthew Harffy. This is the first book, The Serpent Sword, and we follow a Anglo-Saxon warrior, Beerbrand, as he is involved in the sort of all the political manoeuvrings of basically just a really lawless period where, I mean, anyone can set themselves up as a king, or, I mean, a king just basically means like a warlord. You know, it's very small scale raiding type warfare, and Matthew Harffy really gets across the uncertainty of that period very well. And but the best thing about this book is the main character, Beerbrand. You know, he's not your archetypal sort of heroic warrior figure that is a bit of a trope for this kind of like subgenre of historical fiction. He's a much more nuanced character than that. You know, he questions himself an awful lot. He questions, you know, he's a very violent person, but and the violence is what gives him his status in society. But he questions how that affects him as a person, how that affects his society an awful lot. So yeah, if you're interested in this period, which I certainly am, and if that character sounds good to you, then yeah, definitely check this out. And like I say, you can check out my reviews of them if you want more details. And the next series is another one of my all-time favourite series, and that is the Last Kingdom series by Bernard Cornwell. This will be no surprise that this is in this list if you've been following my channel at all. Again, I've done reviews of all these books. I apologise for the quality, particularly of the early ones. They were some of the first videos that I did, but, you know, I didn't know what I was doing. Still don't really. But yeah, this is set again in the Anglo-Saxon period, but in the later Anglo-Saxon period. So, well, you know, mid to late Anglo-Saxon period. So a couple of hundred years after the Bernicia Chronicles. And this is really the story of the creation of the Kingdom of England in the face of sustained invasions from the Vikings, is what most people know them as, Danes, Norsemen, whatever you want to call them. And we follow this through the eyes of Uhtred of Bebbanburg, who is absolutely one of my favourite characters from any kind of fiction, any kind of literature, whatever. I just find him so great to read. You're in his head for the whole story, and man, the guy is a legend. It's full of, really good humour, really good relationships between Uhtred and some of the other characters. Mainly Uhtred, he is the best thing about these books. But Bernard Cornwell, again, he's another one of these writers who clearly has a real passion for this period and has done loads of research into it, and he really gets across the time period without ramming it down your throat, just by having all these little details scattered in there that give you a sense of what it was like at that time, or at least what we understand it to have been like. But yeah, I highly recommend this series. Yeah. And right, so the next few books, this is the last sort of subsection, so just a few more to get through. And these, I put them in here as historical fiction, but these books are all based on sort of semi-legendary figures, so they are set in the real world, in real historical time periods, but we're not too sure if these figures did exist or didn't. They're in the historical record, but they could have existed or not. And the first one, you'll see what I mean. The first one is a novel about King Arthur, or a novel about King Arthur's Britain. King Arthur is not a main character in it. And that is the Albion series by Patrick McCormack. This is the first book, The Last Companion. Again, I've done reviews of the first two books in this trilogy. The third one actually wasn't published, but you can download it for free online from the author's website. I don't know why it wasn't published, because the first two books are absolutely fantastic. And this follows, this is set basically like a generation after King Arthur. So King Arthur has died in the Battle of Camlan, and one of his, knights, although knights wasn't a term that applied at that time, as I'm sure you know. But anyway, yeah, one of his, we'll call them knights, Bedivere, has survived, and he's living in isolation. And this is, again, I think this is a really great portrayal of what would have been a really unsettled time period. And we've got the Romans have left Britain very recently, so all those power structures and institutions that they would have maintained are dissolving before people's eyes, and people are looking for figures of authority that they can follow. And it basically is just like going down to a very small local scale of politics. And this really is a very small scale adventure sort of story. But the really interesting thing about this is the character of Bedivere. He is another one of these characters, much like Beerbrand in the Bernicia Chronicles that I talked about, who is constantly questioning the life of violence that he's chosen. And I really like that aspect of it. And also there's a lot of sort of, not flashbacks necessarily, but there's a lot of, I'd say, sections of the book that are telling stories about King Arthur, or giving Patrick McCormack's take on what he thinks the King Arthur legends would have looked like, and I found them really interesting. That those were my, that and the character of Bedivere, I think, are the best bits of that this series. Right, for the next one, we're going back in time again. We're going back in time. This is the oldest book, or the one set further back in history, I think I've got, and that is the Adventures of Odysseus series by Glyn Iliffe. This is the first one, King of Ithaca. Now, I've got 3 books in this series. That may or may not be all of them. I'm not 100% sure on that, actually. I should have checked that out before I made this video. But of course, this follows the Trojan War. It's got lots of influence from the Iliad, from the Odyssey. Of course, it's about Odysseus. So I suppose really we're verging more on mythology than history here, but it's written as historical fiction. You know, this is not him going off and meeting like gods and monsters and things like that. Although that is these kind of things are definitely like referenced heavily, and there's sort of elements of that happening, but in a much more real world setting. So yeah, if you want something from, you know, again, a really seminal point in Western history, then this is a really good read for that. Right, and next up we've got Hood by Stephen Lawhead, which is his take on the Robin Hood legends, as you can probably guess from the title. But he sets this in medieval Wales during the period when the Normans are sort of encroaching on the Welsh princedoms of the time, which I just thought was a really interesting take on it. And this is another one of these ones that's it's very small scale. You know, these are not like world-changing events. It's a guy just fighting for his local, like fighting in his local area. But yeah, Stephen Lawhead has written a couple of like really good series. This is one of them, and the other one is the Pendragon cycle, which is another one about King Arthur. I decided to go for the Robin. I think this one is slightly better, and also his take on King Arthur is verging more on I would say historical fantasy than historical fiction, whereas this is much more in the vein of historical fiction. So I went for this one for this video, but definitely both of them are worth checking out. And we've got another Robin Hood one here. This is the Outlaw Chronicles by Angus Donald, and it's a completely different take than the Stephen Lawhead ones. You know, in this one, it turns out that Robin Hood is a Norman baron. Basically, sorry if I don't think that spoils anything. It definitely doesn't spoil anything. There's a fair few books in this series. I think 8. I've read them all, and they are very good. Particularly the early ones. I'd say that maybe the last couple of books do tail off a little bit, but it's definitely worth reading this series, because the first few particularly are really excellent. You follow the story of Robin Hood through the eyes of one of his merry men, I guess, Alan Dale, who ends up becoming like a knight and whatever. But it's a really good action-heavy romp through medieval England and later on through Europe as well. So yeah, plenty of battles and sieges and all that malarkey. So yeah, definitely worth reading if you like adventure-based historical fiction. I mean, this could have quite happily gone in with those other action-adventure heavy ones, but I decided to put it in with the semi-legendary figures section, just arbitrarily. Right, and finally we've got, this is a really good book. This is book 1 of the Pendragon's Banner trilogy. It's called The King Making. It's by Helen Hollick, and this is another King Arthur based trilogy. It's set in the middle of the 5th century, so we're talking literally just when Rome is leaving, or well, just when Rome is officially sort of setting the British Isles off to do their own thing, you know, no longer be part of the Roman Empire. And this is very real world take on the King Arthur legends. You know, this is King Arthur if it really did happen. And for me, this really, you know, brought to life a very mysterious, you know, period of history. It's something that we don't know an awful lot about. There are very few sources from this period, but Helen Hollick does a really great job of tying it all together in a coherent narrative and mixing in a lot of these, like, as I say, semi-legendary figures. If you're into the King Arthur legends, then this, you've got to read this. I think this is top stuff. Right, so there you go. If you have read any of those series, if any of them interest you, if you've got any more suggestions for me based on these, I would love to hear them in the comments. Please let me know. I know this was a long video. If you've made it to the end, then give yourself a pat on the back. But yeah, I hope to hear from you in the comments, and goodbye. See you next time.